All right, everyone, welcome to the This is High Octane Ableton Workshop. Thank you guys so much for coming.
You're looking at the best.
Woo! No, for real. I'm so stoked to dive into this and share some knowledge. And thank you guys so much for coming out. I'm so glad that the music has connected with you guys, and it means the world. This is going to be super, super informal throughout the whole time. If you have any questions, just blurt it out. I've started here with Pump Up the Vibe. So I don't know if you've heard it or not. I'll play a little preview, and then we can kind of dive into a little bit of the writing process and how it came to be. So here's roughly how it sounds. If you haven't heard it, I'll play it from kind of the breakdown build up. That's the gist of it all. We can kind of get into some of the nitty-gritties of it. With all of my music and my writing process, I always start with the drums, and I always get that groove down first. For me, I always find if I can get my drums as high energy and as full of life and full of super like exciting grooves, I know that no matter what kind of bass I put underneath it, what other leads, whatever else I put underneath it, it's going to still feel like it has lots of energy. If you're finding you're working on tracks and you're like, man, I'm feeling like this is lacking energy, almost all the time it's in the drums more than anything else. What I would have started with first is probably just a really, really simple breakbeat pattern with the kick and maybe some of the snare. Let me just solo some of that stuff and we can kind of break through it. So that's the whole kind of breakbeat groove. And what I likely would have done in this case, full disclosure, the original version of Pump Up the Vibe was written probably like a year and a half, 2 years ago. And it sat on my computer for a really long time. And I figured I couldn't release it as Cloverdale because it wasn't really house music. And then when this EP was kind of coming about, I was like, you know what? I have this song that I love. So I went back in. I changed a few things kind of in October. But the majority of it is from a session that I wrote like 2 years ago. So not all of it is super fresh in my memory. But what I likely would have done is found a drum break that I liked. And in this case, my assumption is it's probably this one here. And I would have dragged it out. And this is probably a full like drum loop of sorts. And let me just solo this, see what we got. And from that, I would have gotten a few things. I would have taken a look at where the kick placements are. And maybe I would have just been like, okay, look, they have a kick there, they have a kick there, they have a kick there. And I would have just gone, sort of copied some of the kick placement. And it looks like maybe this wasn't the exact break that I used because I see I have a kick up here. But oftentimes, that's a good starting place for me. It's just seeing, okay, like I'll load in a few other drum breaks or maybe load in a couple other songs, or load in whatever to get a feel for, okay, where are they placing their kicks? Where are the snares? What are kind of like different drum fills that they're using? Just to kind of like get my head in the game and inspired for a beat and a groove. I'm not going to like always just toss in a full break and just use the whole thing, but just reference sort of where those drum hits are going to go. I would have done that, placed the kicks and the snares. As far as sample selection goes, you can see a few of these are muted and turned off. I swapped out this snare sample a million times until I found one that was like working. In the end, I think there's two that are layered. There's this fancy, I think, Noisia snare. so we know it's going to sound good with zero processing on it. Luke's laughing. He's like, of course it's going to sound good. But I think there's something to note there is that when say you're pulling samples off of Splice or wherever you're getting them from, it's good to take a note. Is the sample that you've downloaded, is it already superly heavily processed, heavily worked on? A snare like this, if I'm zooming into it and it looks like this, squashed to shit and clipped to hell, I'm probably not going to need to add a bunch of extra compression or saturation, distortion, whatever. This sample is already completely processed, and so you're not going to want to overdo it. It's pretty much good to go. If you're dealing with maybe live recorded drums, there's a lot more work and a lot more processing that might go into those to get those sounding big and full. So just pay attention. I think a lot of times people will over-process the samples that they download from Splice or from wherever. You'll notice in a lot of my projects, I have very minimal processing, and it's because I try to make sure that the sound that is the input, the initial sample, the initial sound, is really high quality to begin with. Something else to notice here that we're doing, and big ups Luke who taught me this tip years ago, is that you sometimes don't want transients to stack on top of each other. This is especially true for snares and claps and hi-hats. This snare here has a really harsh transient. The initial sound is really harsh. And this is the layer that I have layered underneath it, which is sort of just like a more of a drum layer. And if I stacked both of these, say I don't have a fade here, these would kind of click, and they'd almost like clip and clash right here in the transient. The transient would become too harsh if they're both playing at the same time. And so I often just pick one transient, and then you can just do a little fade like this. It's almost like a side chain. And now the two of them work versus very subtle things, but those are things that in the end, all of these are going to go into a group, and once you start stacking really loud sounds on top of really loud sounds on top of really loud sounds, those are going to start affecting your limiting and start affecting your compression channels on your master and on your groups and stuff like that. So just try to minimize that where you can, especially on really loud sounds like your snare and your kick. Those are probably more important. Okay. Any questions on that thus far?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if you have any comparisons if you're stacking rather layering snare sounds versus clap sounds. If you take a similar approach, or if snare has if you are a little bit more soft-handed with snares because they're a bit more kind of
No, I think it's probably a same approach. It would depend again on the initial sample, whether you could be dealing with claps that are really snappy claps. And generally, when it comes to layering, I try to really only layer sounds that are very different from each other, right? So say I had a really dull snare and I wanted to brighten it up. I'm going to layer a brighter layer on top of it. Or vice versa. Maybe you have a really bright snare and you want to have it sound a little more dull. You're going to layer that. Versus, you're not just layering for the sake of layering. You don't want to just be okay, I have this snare and then this other snare sounds sick, and I just put them both on top of each other because I wanted it much more bigger, louder. It doesn't really work like that. You're always trying to layer with a purpose and layer for a reason and be okay, this snare isn't sounding bright enough to me. I want it brighter. And so I'm going to find another snare that really carries that brightness. It doesn't even need to have the low end or the body or the beef. You're just listening for that brightness that you want to layer on top. You find that and put it in. But yeah, I think it is 100% sample dependent, and some samples are going to be really snappy and some samples are going to be not super snappy. So you just want to make sure that you're layering a floppy one with a snappy one. In this case, the break that I used initially to kind of base it off, you'll notice I didn't end up using the whole thing. I kind of just chopped out the snare and that little fill and a couple other snares here. The reason being, and I do this with a lot of loops that I'm using in my tracks, is a lot of times they come with a bunch of stuff that you don't necessarily need that is, making the rest of the track a little muddy, a little messy, a little more overcomplicated than it needs to be. So I, will go in and be what, I didn't need this sort of shaker bit. I didn't need this other bit. I'm just going to use exactly what I need, chop up the loop, and go from there. Continuing on drums, we got a little rolling hi-hat. Little fancy. This I think is coming in from the kick, so it's getting ducked out from the kick, and then also usually, my assumption, this is 22. Oh, it's getting ducked out from the snare as well. But sometimes I'll also sidechain it to my open hi-hat as well, which will sometimes create a cool little rhythm between the two hi-hats. A little bit of auto pan there, but you'll notice throughout the whole thing, like, yeah, none of these really have any major processing. A little bit of glue compression on my drum. What is this? My snare. And a little bit of saturation. Same on the group. But like overly, as a whole, not a lot of processing. And I think the big takeaway there is just that the trying to find all of those samples that work really, really well together, that all sort of jive well together. There's probably, surprised I don't have any like saturation on this. Again, it's an old project, so usually I would have some sort of like tape saturator or something on the group. But yeah, so that is pretty much most of what kind of went into this drum group. A lot of trial and error, a lot of referencing other tracks, referencing other like either drum groups or loops or whatever, and trying to get it really light and lively. As far as the kick goes, I have two layers. One is, the main beef of it all. And then this layer is just another kind of high-end layer that kind of is a transient to add a little bit more presence. And same thing goes with kicks. You don't want to over layer and stack a bunch of things. Things can get really messy and complicated, especially if you're layering a bunch of low ends. Try to layer. You're far better off to swap the sample than like have 10 stacks of kicks. I would never have more than 2 really, unless you really, really needed it and it sounded awesome. Generally, you're going to probably do better with just 1. I do my sidechain with a trigger, which meaning I have this MIDI note that is routed to a bus that is routed to LFO tool. This is slightly confusing, but basically I just have a bus at the top that I use for my sidechain. And the reason I do this is simply just for workflow. It's just so that, as I'm building out my song, say I had a new layer here, I could then, and that I wanted it to be sidechain, instead of routing it to my master here, I can route it to sidechain bus. And now everything that goes through this bus gets ducked with this LFO tool with these MIDI triggers. I have 2 of these. Again, just workflow reasons. The light version is just like a shorter, smaller one. These are just built into my template. So every time I open up Ableton, they're just there. I don't need to set it up every time. It's just like quick. In theory, if you wanted, you could go and put your own sidechain and LFO tools on each individual track you wanted to, if you wanted. Once I kind of got the kick and the drums down, I would have moved on to the bass. In this case, I'll play that for you so it sounds. Bass in this case is an 808 sample that I've kind of layered and processed a little bit. Similarly, so I have, this is sort of the main one that's carrying almost all of the weight. And so I probably, let's see if anything, I would have pitched it using just the pitching here, but I think it mostly just plays the same note. Oh, maybe a couple of these are pitched up, maybe. Anyways. Oh, these ones are. These whoa, 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 whoa. So basically, I just kept the root note, which is E, and I would have pitched it here. Now, what I didn't do is I didn't warp it and stretch it because I wanted to retain the like highest quality of the sample. Anytime you're warping something and moving it around and stretching it and making it longer or shorter or whatever, you're losing a little bit of quality from the sample because it has to use the stretching algorithm or whatnot. And so even if I'm pitching the sound, so in these cases here, I'm pitching it up one semitone, but I didn't warp it. It's going to continue to be it's going to get shorter. It's not going to stay in time, but I don't really care because it's just a one shot. If it was like a whole melody that I was warping, then I'd probably want to have it warped. But in this case where it's just a one shot, I don't need to worry about that. Other than that, I simply just chopped it up, created fades, placed it along versus, writing a MIDI out. Sometimes I find my workflow is just a little faster and I can kind of get some more creative results by just fucking around with this sort of stuff and chopping and being a little bit more brute force about certain things. In the end, it's all about just finding what works for you. If what works for you is just opening up a MIDI channel and messing around with SERUM or messing around with like MIDI and writing a melody and all that stuff, hell yeah. If what works for you is loading in a sample and chopping it all up and repositioning it, hell yeah. Like it's just about like getting into that groove and getting into that headspace of like trying shit out and just like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this. And you're just throwing shit at the page until something sticks. Every time, like even here, I'm opening up this project and what you're seeing is the finished product. And what I want to try and get at is like, I tried a billion things throughout this whole process and it's all about just throwing stuff at the page, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, and then building off of that, right? These layers here aren't crazy. They're, I think, this one has a little bit of erosion and probably Saturn. So it's, heavily distorted. This layer here, same deal, maybe with some imaging. So this one's like a wider layer. So it's adding a little bit of stereo imaging to not necessarily the sub, but from like 100 to like 1,000 in that range. That's what we're widening up. My basses will always have at least some width to it. You want to keep, say, below 80-ish in mono for sure. But anything above that, you can really get away with a little bit of width and not have any crazy phase issues. There's a lot of room in the mix that way to kind of get weird and wide down there. And then this first hit is just a different sample. And so it's same deal, just creating fades. And then all of this whole group, a little bit of OTT, you'll see I have a bunch of EQs, the EQ. And the reason why they're always like stacking one after another is that simply I probably had this one. I liked how it sounded. It sounded pretty good, but maybe it just had a little bit too much highs and there was a little spike around like 120. And so I ducked those out. Instead of me fucking around with this, messing this up, instead I'll just add another one. In theory, you could do it with just one. So that would have done the basses. And then everything else, once you have that down, everything else is just fun sounds that you're just trying to see, what can I get in there to like, fill out the melody to keep your attention, or little shouts or fills or turnaround moments. Everything else, I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but everything else is where you can get really creative. There's far less rules with everything else. So I would have probably started with this horn stab. I'm a sucker for stabs, especially on the first beat of the one. If you go back now and listen to every Cloverdale song, there's probably one. And then same deal, I probably, added in this other stab thing here next. Fun fact, if you guys know my tune Ill Provide with Local Singles, this is like the same little sound that's in it. It's like, anyways, little tidbit. A little Easter egg. But all these sounds, I'm just kind of like finding little hits and sounds, placing them in. Some work, some don't work. I'm really just kind of like moving piece by piece, very, very like carefully. I'm not saying, okay, like once I've put this in, I'm not building an entire like my entire song around to this one thing. I'm just kind of placing it in one specific little spot, taking a step back, being like, okay, this is all feeling good. Where else is a spot? Maybe I have an empty spot somewhere, or maybe I'm also looking for turnaround moments. So anytime a turnaround moment is usually the last, say, 4 beats of a measure or 4 beats of a bar, that's where you can have some sort of either fills, or you can usually introduce new sounds that you haven't done before, usually near the end or the beginning of a phrase. I mean, sometimes it's right on the one where you introduce a new sound, but sometimes it can also be like the last section of and that's kind of what's happening here. This is just a Reese that just opens up. Again, just a sample. This thing here is just like a phone sound, I think. It's fading in. And so this kind of acts as my turnaround moment here. And you can see as I play this sound, the energy's kind of moving in this direction. Same thing with this. Things are kind of moving upwards. I'm always trying to keep the song propelling forward, and anything like that is always going to allow me to do that. That things are driving forward, and using those turnaround moments to do that can kind of keep the track always feeling like it's moving forward, that there's something else coming. So back into that. Oh, this is the most classic wheel up signal from the I think that's one of the OG ones. Yo, again, I gotta shout out Luke a million times over again. If you guys don't know Luke, he produces under the name Chasing Luma, and he is one of the most talented producers in the world. Him and I were roommates for like 5 years, and so I got all my skills from him for sure. But there's a pack called Jungle 1989. I have it in here. Anyways, every producer in the world should have it. It has all of the old like Amen breaks and all the old OG. Here it is, 89 to 99, and it has everything you could ever need if you wanted to write jungle. Anyways, it's free. It's a free pack. That's why we're getting at it, because it's free. Write her down. Free pack. And what's great about sounds like that, and what's great about samples that we all have used before. I say the same things about the 909 kit and the 808 kit. When you put these samples into your songs, it almost instantly makes them part of an ethos, part of a era of music, part of a genre or a style. You put a 909 open hat in your track, it's like, oh damn, okay, we are writing house music right now. We're writing techno. Like, this is the quintessential sound. Yeah, when in doubt, if my song is feeling maybe a little like disjointed, or like I'm not feeling like it is feeling as maybe authentic or heady or underground enough, I'm gonna reach for those packs, the 909, the 808, the vintage jungle samples, all of those, just to kind of put it in that world, put it in that ethos. That is the 100% why I would have done that and would have used this wheel up signal, is simply just to kind of like give it that bit of, oh look, that nod to the OGs, to the legends that have done us before. Okay, we have this lead that comes in. It's such a simple lead. Let's see if it. So the lead, SERUM, it's probably, what do we got? Saw wave and a sine wave. Anytime I'm doing crazy like plucks like this, I find, at least lately, I used to be a like patch surfer snob all the time, and just like constantly digging through these crazy patches, and I'd end up with patches that would come preloaded with like a fuck ton of effects, and they'd be like these really lush, crazy soundscape patches. And I find oftentimes now, if I can get one that is simpler and a little more basic, and then I add in all the extra stuff that I want, I'm generally going to end up with a little bit cleaner a result. I'm not an incredible sound designer by any means. It's not something I've spent a lot of time with, but I do find if you can learn the basics of, simply just routing, envelopes to filters and just adjusting your attack and decay and sustain and release, and then knowing, here's where the octaves are, and layering two different oscillators between this oscillator and this oscillator, and then messing around with some shapes. If you can kind of just get those basics down, you can do a lot. You don't need to overcomplicate too much more than that, especially if you're just trying to, write some simple basses or some simple plucks or whatever. We're not writing crazy, dubstep sound design, in which case maybe you want to get a little bit more wild. But in this case, super simple pluck. Let's solo it for a second. A little bit of chorus on there, giving it some of that width. Same with some of this hyperdimension. And then I have some delay, an amp. Oh, crystallizer is definitely what's creating a little bit of those cool little crystals. So without crystallizer, it doesn't have some of those. Little extra delay glitches, kind of like a subtle little add on top of that. Any questions on this little pluck? I'm automating the filter cutoff, so the filter's probably opening over time. Where's that? Or maybe that just happens in this build up over here. That's it. But even here, it kind of opens up over time, the filter cutoff. Same with this is not. Oh, what's interesting is this the attack. So they basically at the beginning, the attack's kind of long, so it's each note's kind of fading in, and so that's kind of an interesting way to introduce the synth over time. The filter's opening up, and the attack is getting shorter, and so it's starting to sound more plucky over time. This whole section also has this big riser that kind of carries throughout from the intro throughout this whole period. It's kind of constantly rising in the background. I find if I can have elements, especially even if they're like subtle rising elements that can transfer from my intro through the buildup, instead of having my riser start when the buildup starts, I'll have it start, maybe the last 8 bars of my intro and have it continue and carry through. I find that way I can kind of almost carry the energy a little bit better sometimes. So that's what this is doing. And it's just... Again, super simple sound design. In this case, it is a preset, but it's just, if we were to make this ourselves, it's literally just 2 saw waves. This one's detuned slightly. And then a sub. We could do that, no problem. Nothing else major here, So, and that's actually not even pitching up. It's just filter automating, getting bigger. There's some other stuff happening over here. I guess we'll do a quick talk about the vocals, and then we'll move on to another track. So the vocals, there's a bunch of different samples in here. We got this one.
3, 2, 1.
We got this one.
Jump.
We got this one. This one's got some delay on it. Woo! I find I would really ram my tracks full of vocals, tons of vocals. There are always little shouts, little blips, little boops. I find anytime I'm feeling my track feels dull or not full of life or slightly inorganic, any vocal, whether even if it's just a vocal texture. Say you take a vocal and put it in a sampler and then make a melody of it, and it doesn't sound like a vocal at all. Now it's a synth. The human ear loves the sound of the human voice, and even just something like that can really make your track go from something that is very, digital and inorganic to feeling a lot more organic. Someone told me when I was like starting out producing, and it literally changed how I thought about producing completely. They were like, you guys are making music on computers, and all you really want to do is make it sound like it was not made on a computer. And that's like super smart. And a great way to think about things is you always want to be adding little imperfections, little timing discrepancies, little maybe the hi-hat you're using changes in volume, and maybe it has a little bit of randomness to it. Maybe it has a little bit of swing. Maybe it has a little bit of groove. Maybe it's not completely rigid. Anything like that is going to make your track feel way looser, way more organic, way more full of life. And that goes with, why we enjoy, some of the plugins that we enjoy, why we enjoy like tape saturators, and why we enjoy, tube amps. These things are technically plugins to make our sounds sound shittier and make them sound more organic and more vintage. But there's a reason for that, and it's almost like, part of it is making the music sound like it is old and that it is vintage and whatnot. So trying to think like that always, and trying to make it sound, you're not always trying to make your song sound super clean. You're just trying to make it sound super good. Questions on this track, or questions in general before I open up another one? This one's not too many. This one's 69. Really all depends. And I think every producer goes through this journey of, you start out and your tracks are like, 20 to 30 songs, and then you like learn all of the tools. And then all of a sudden your tracks are like 200 tracks long, and you're like layering a million things, and you're doing this, and you're doing that. And I don't know, I know this happened to me, probably happened to you. And then, a few years later, you're like, okay, and now I'm back to like 20 or 30 tracks again. Because you as soon as you learn all the tools, you want to use all the tools, and you think, as you're writing the song, that you should be adding, you're like, it's not done yet, and so I should be adding more. And it's not done yet, and so I need to add more. And I think that's just sort of how our brains often think, or like, I must do more. But oftentimes, if you're feeling like it's not done yet, it's not necessarily, you don't always need to add more. Sometimes it's taking things away. Sometimes it's just focusing on, what are the really, really key elements of this song that are the meat and potatoes of the song, and what is just added in there that I thought, might be kind of cool, and maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be there. Maybe it's distracting. I think if you can get a really, really good song, and that it's sounding like full and exciting in like 20 or so tracks, then anything else that you're adding in underneath is just sort of like extra stuff that's going to pump up what's already there. So, but I'll often produce into a limiter. Now, I know that's not like typical. I know a lot of people don't do that, but my thoughts are, I want to hear how my track is going to interact with that limiter as I'm adding new things. I want to know how my song is going to sound at its final stage early on in the process. And so for the versus, the traditional way, which would be, leave yourself lots of headroom, and, don't squash it. And, I find if I do that, I end up not being able to push it as loud in the end. I don't know why that is, but I find if I just push it right into the limiter from the beginning, I'm good. Sometimes I will like take it off and double check and turn it down and see like, how does my mix sound without that limiter on? But oftentimes I'll leave it rammed in there. This one, I have it quite driven. Now the reason why is probably as I'm writing the track, it's like a constant dance between me turning the limiter up, turning my elements down, turning more elements down, turning my limiter up. And as I produce the song, it's usually, it'll start here, and all my elements will slowly get quieter. My limiter will slowly get up as I add more things, as I turn more things. And that's generally sort of what happens as I produce. Whether this is all good advice or not, I'm not entirely sure. But I think what really matters is just making sure that you're figuring out what works for you. You're getting into a rhythm of like, hey, this is what I like to do. This is what works for me. This is how I achieve the results that I want. And so I encourage you to try it this way. I encourage you to try it the other way. See what works best for you. That's my only topic on mastering. I'm not talking anymore about it. Okay. Let's open up. We'll do fade, and then maybe we'll talk about up to no good a little bit. But we'll do fade, and then we'll dance and chill.